Okay, so let's open project number 2 here. It's called Shapes Comp. Go ahead and double click to open that. And we can see initially that it's just filled with complete white. And the reason for that is we have a white solid in here, which is ready to have our first brand new shape filter applied to it, which is called Circle. So let's come down to the timeline and select layer number 4. You can see here it's called Circle Solid, and it obviously shows up with a white icon here, another new feature of After Effects 6. Go ahead and select that, and then in the effects palette, let's just select that and go ahead and type in Circle. And that will come up with the filter. Let's go ahead and double click that just to apply it to our layer. And now we can see something different. We have video footage here in the background, which is set to work on. That's fine. And we also have a letter that's in here as well. That's going to become part of our animation in a short while. Now, you can see that the circle effect controls are very straightforward. It's kind of using a geometric shape on the screen. But a lot of people wonder why generating a circle is handy. Well, it's exceptionally handy for a lot of very quick animation and even for masking, because the only other ways really to create a circle are to draw a mask and actually stroke it using the stroke filter, which you can then thicken up enough to give you a solid circle, or you can obviously just use the circular mask itself. But if you want to make a path that has like a thickness to it, that's a problem, because if you wish to animate the size of the circle but keep the thickness the same, that can become a bit of an issue because you have two separate masks and it's very difficult to keep them in direct proportion to each other. So the circle filter here, although it's very, very basic, does have some really nice features. So obviously the first one here is the center point. That allows us to decide exactly where on the layer it will appear. Well, for this whole thing, we're going to leave it in the center, so I'll just undo all my movement there. The radius is obviously the inner radius, or the overall size of the circle, which we can drag up or down. And don't forget, you could be using this as a mask if you wanted to, so easy control of that. And I'm going to set this to about 150 pixels at this point. Now here's an option that says the edge, and at the moment it's set to none. So see the other options we have here. We have edge radius, thickness, thickness times radius, and thickness and feather times radius. I'm just going to take a quick look at these two. I'm going to start with thickness initially, and this is where I say this is very handy instead of using two separate masks, because we can take a thickness value here, which is set as a default of 10 pixels, go ahead and drag that to increase or decrease the size, and you see it's based around the center line of the circle. So if we're down to just 1 pixel there, you can just see it. If you go ahead and drag out, it's based centrally on that line. But then if I took the radius here and increase that, the thickness of the line stays exactly at the value I had it set to, which is 38 in this case. So this just makes it very easy to animate shapes like this on screen just using one filter. Let me just undo and go back to our 150 there. We also have an edge radius, and this is the one we're going to be using in just a second. And what that does is you see that the value here that said thickness now says edge radius, and this is the inner radius. The overall size we have here is the standard radius, that's our 150 pixels. The edge radius here is another circle which is inside this one, which you see I can pull out, and if I go beyond the 150, it will actually swap over and go out the other side. So it's a very interesting little tool where you can animate from a solid circle to a punched out circle with two very simple keyframes, and that's how we're going to set this up. So let's take the edge radius value here all the way down to 0 again, so there's no inner circle. And then what we'll do is just scroll down here inside the effect controls window, and we can see here we have the color for the circle itself. I'm just going to click on that to bring up the color picker, and I'm going to choose kind of a light blue to match the A line of the New York subway. And we can see there now obviously our A stays on top, so we've got the right color. Now what we can do is apply a couple of very simple animation keyframes. Now before we do, let's go ahead and click on the invert circle button here. I actually want to start with the outside visible in the inside invisible. Then we can animate the edge radius point to move. So let's go ahead and turn on a keyframe there for edge radius, and we are at 0 seconds on our timeline. Let's turn that on. Then I'll just hit Control G or Command G on the Mac, and let's just go straight to 10 frames. Just type in 10. Take us 10 frames along in the animation, and I'm going to take the edge radius now all the way up to about 350. And you see there we have the nice invert option as the circle passes through itself. So we now end up with an inner shape and an outer shape through which we can see the video. So that's a pretty good start to our animation. What we'll then do is let's go to 15 frames across. So once again, I'm going to use Control G or Command G for that. Say 15, takes us right to where we need to be. And we're going to apply another keyframe, but this time it will be for the color, because we're going to change lines here from A to F, which is going to be orange. So let's turn on the keyframe option there for color, and then we'll go just another 5 frames down the timeline, so this time to 20. And then go ahead and click on color and set that to an orange. And we should have one round about here. There we go, say okay. So now we have a color fade. If we just scrub the timeline back and forth there, we can see that as the graphics move through and change from letter to letter, we have a color shift, which is just fine. Let's back up to where the color change applied, and let's also adjust the feather value. Now, there are two feather values inside of this filter. If we click on feather here in the effect controls window, you see we have an outer and an inner. I can just expand that, you can see it. So the outer edge can be animated in terms of feather values, which is a very nice way of doing it. Let's just undo that. And we can obviously do the inner edge at a separate value. So again, this is like using masks. We could just have two separate masks and use feather on each of them, but this is so much more flexible. It's all one layer and very, very easy to keyframe and scale. So what we're going to do is animate the outer edge. So I'm going to turn on a keyframe for that. Once again, let's say go to 20 frames. And let's just increase the feather on the outer edge to, I don't know, around about 50 or 60, something like that, just to soften it up. So if we now scrub through the timeline, let's go back to the very beginning. We can see we start with our blue shape. It grows outwards to the side. And we've got a crossover of color and also a fade of feather around the edge. So we've got a good mixture of effects going on here. Let's go out a little bit further. I'm going to go all the way out to where the F changes across to the Q, which is around about 105. And we'll also make another few changes here. So I'm going to take the edge radius and we're just going to make another few changes. So let me just open up the window here. We're actually going to make 3 changes at the same time. Because we're at 105, we want everything that's happening at this point to continue up to 105, and then we can keyframe on from there. So if I hold down the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and click on Edge Radius, the Feather, and the Color, I will apply a keyframe for each of those 3 properties at their current value, so it will stay consistent up to this point. What we'll do now is just scrub a further 5 frames along, so let's go to 10. This is at the point that the Q appears, and the Q line is actually going to be in yellow, so let's go ahead and choose a color for that. Say OK, that's now changed. We'll also take the feather here down to 0, so it's nice and sharp again. And let's take the edge radius down, I don't know, about 250 or so, somewhere around about there. So again, we've got a good mix here of color changes, everything going on. We've got feathering and scale. Let's round this up to finish out the animation. I'm going to go across to about 125. And again, this is where the Q then slides off the side of the screen. So we need to just finish up these circles. And all I'm going to do is apply a keyframe here for, again, the edge radius, Option or Alt click on there, and go all the way up to the top. And this time apply one for the general radius. We haven't applied any animation to that as yet, and we are going to from this point. So let's turn on the stopwatch for radius also. And then let's move along all the way to the end of this layer, which is actually here at 210, just at the point that these hearts appear. And we'll take the inner radius and drag that all the way down to 0, so it disappears. You see you can go for a minus value there as well, so don't drag too far. And we'll take the edge radius, the outer one, and drag that as far as it needs to go until it disappears off screen. So not too far, otherwise it will disappear a little too quickly. Let's go for about 450. So I'm going to close the effect controls window down there, and at the moment I am at 210 on my timeline. I'm just going to hit the N key on my keyboard to change my work area's endpoint to there. And now when I do a RAM preview, it will only preview the area that we've just animated. So we can see all of the circle effects we've done using one very simple and brand new filter inside of After Effects 6. You can see it gives you some pretty cool animation tools. Now talking of fun tools, we have a new filter inside of After Effects 6 called Scribble, and we're going to use that on these heart shapes that you see appear at the end of the animation. So I'm just going to click to stop the preview and then just hit Control Z or Command Z on the Mac and undo the work area change that we made. So it now plays again for the whole animation. And then let's come down to the timeline and just hit the solo button here for layer number 2, which is this red solid called Scribble Solid. Go ahead and choose that, and all we're left with are these heart shapes. Now if you select that layer, you'll also see when you do, these yellow lines appear around the outside of the hearts. Well, these are obviously all masks, okay? You can always click on them and drag them around just to be sure. You can see that that's exactly what's happened. And these are shapes that I just copied and pasted in from Illustrator. If we come down here again to the layer, just click on it to bring the timeline to the foreground and hit the M key, that will reveal the 3 masks I have in here, which are main heart, small heart left, and small heart right. And the order in which these are stacked is important when we're using the Scribble filter, especially when we're going to try and animate them appearing one by one. So the main heart will be filled first, the second heart, and then the third heart. Okay, so that's the order I've placed them in. You can go ahead and close that up. We don't need that. Let's come back up to the main window here. Once again, go to our effects palette and let's type in Scribble, or as close as you need to until it brings up the filter. And again, double click to apply that to the layer, and then the effect controls window will come up. You'll see that there is already an effect in here, the radial shadow. And if you noticed earlier when the hearts rendered with the circles, there was a shadow beneath them. So that is already applied. And I'm going to drag it down to the bottom of the effect controls window so it will be applied after the scribble. So just storing that down there. Now let's take a look at what this filter offers us. If I just pull the effect controls over here, we can see that by default, one of the hearts is filled with this white scribble effect. And what I'm going to make sure here is, let me just take my timeline back to 2 seconds. And again, just hit the B key this time, which will change the work area to begin at 2 seconds. So every time we do a preview now, we won't see any of the circle information or any of the black area at this point. The first 2 seconds would be black because we've hidden all the other layers. So I'm just changing my work area, but you can see that we filled one mask here with this white scribble effect. And if we just do a quick preview of that, you can see that the scribble effect is animated and filling the inside and slightly over the edge of the mask that it's been applied to. And you can see this is a really nice little effect. You can imagine immediately lots of applications for this. I'll just click and stop the preview there. Let's come back to the effect controls. We can see here that the reason it's filled one shape only is because in the top here it says it's selected to fill a single mask. What we can do is select all masks, which would include every mask regardless of whether it has a transfer mode or not, such as add or difference. Even if a mask was set to none, so it didn't actually mask any part of the layer out, this would still activate it and fill it with a scribble. If you only wanted to use masks that had modes, you also have an option for that. But we're going to set all masks here so all 3 shapes are filled. Now we also have the fill type here, which at the moment is set to inside, so obviously the inside of each mask is filled with the scribble. We can select 3 edge options, beginning with centered edge, which then takes a specific thickness and applies it around the outside of each mask, and centrally so, you can see it's evenly divided over the yellow line. And then underneath the fill type, we now have the edge options, which is available. And if we drop that down, we have the width right here. So we can just click and drag to scale that up, and it appears a lot bigger. And if you do go a little bit further, the lines will start to eat into each other, and you get this nice overlap of animated lines. Again, just a quick RAM preview will show that these paths are still moving. Okay, so again, some very interesting artistic impressions here. We can also choose to have the inside edge only, which stays directly within inside the masks, but again, just works on the width value that you specify. And if you have the width too high there, you can see that the hearts in the bottom left and bottom right are actually filled because the thickness is a little too thick for their inside area. So let's just bring that back a bit. There we go. And we can obviously choose the outside edge as well, so it just sticks on the outside. Now you'll see also that the scribble is slightly appearing within the path here, and that's because there's also a path overlap, which is actually down here under the stroke option setting. Okay, we can see here we have curviness and spacing. We have a path overlap function here. If we just expand that out, you can see path overlap and variation. At the moment, the variation is set to 5, so there's a slight 5% increase of movement, which allows the path to slightly overlap. We can choose a definitive value, which will always overlap to a specific percentage, say 11%. And then on top of that, there is a further 5% randomness, which you can always drag up and down as much as you want to. And if we just set it to about there, again, just do a very quick preview, you can see the different type of effects we're now getting. Okay, so it's looking pretty fun. What I'm going to do is just back up a few steps and go back down to the fill option. So I'm just going to hit Control Z or Command Z. Just keep going back until we're set to the fill and the basic fill that we started with on our shape. There we go. Now, if I just scroll to the top of the Effect Controls window here and just turn the scribble off for a second, we can see the layer was originally filled with red. It was a red solid with masks applied. As soon as we turn on the scribble effect, the scribble appears in white, and that's because there is a color setting here, but that doesn't mean that we can only use this for color. If we come all the way down to the very bottom of the palette, we can see a composite option. Okay, now at the moment it says on transparent. That means that we are seeing transparency through the black shapes here. If we just come down to the comp window and turn on transparency, we can see that. I can see right the way through here to the transparent pixels behind, as well as my drop shadow. But as well as doing transparent, we can also say on the original image. And that will actually paint the white strokes onto the original red solid. And don't forget, the red solid is also masked out using these 3 masks that we filled with scribble. And we can also use one other option. Let's just pull this up here, scroll down a bit more. And we can see the final one there we have is reveal original image. And this is a cool one because it will allow us to mask out, using the scribble, the layer that's beneath it, which in this case is obviously red. So it looks like we filled it with red, but we haven't. If this layer was a movie, we would actually be able to see the movie effect appearing through these strokes here. So do bear those in mind. You have 3 different options there. I'm actually just going to go back to transparent, okay, and come back up to where we have our color setting and go in there and choose the color I wish, which in this case, again, will be set to red, okay? So pretty handy thing for doing masking as well. Now, the other things we have are obviously the type of stroke that's being applied. Now, we have the angle here, which is set to 60 degrees. We can obviously rotate that round and have the stroke draw from any side. And don't forget, all of these properties are animatable as well. Let me just set that back to 60. Then we also have the stroke width. Now, once you start to play with this, it will affect greatly the appearance of these shapes. We just increase that, and as you do, obviously, they will start to fill in quite rapidly. All right. Now, you can always use Control on the PC or Command on the Mac to drag that value just a decimal point one at a time, gives you a little bit more control. But then what you might want to do is come down here to the stroke options and adjust the spacing, and this will allow you to open up the gaps between those strokes, even though you've made them thicker. And this will actually produce a very interesting effect, looking like you're drawing this with kind of one straight line that just goes back and forth rather than a whole selection of scribbled lines. And there's my preview again. So it's a very different looking effect, and you can achieve all of this by just playing around with some of these settings. There's my real-time preview. Okay. We also have the curviness setting here, which will define how bent the lines are, how curved they are. If we drag that, you see they're more rounded at the end or come all the way back down to 0. They're actually very straight at the end. If I drag that a lot further, they will start to cross over each other, almost in kind of a spirograph pattern, which gives a very interesting effect. And again, the curviness variation will kind of mess that up a little bit more randomly. Once again, let's do a preview. And again, something completely different. Almost looks like a 3D shape that's made up of a series of wires or strings that are moving one on top of the other. So very interesting indeed. Now let me just back up a couple of steps. Let's go back to where we were, round about there. That'll do. Another option we have further down the bottom here is what's called the wiggle type. Now at the moment it's set to a smooth wiggle, which as you can see is a very soft pulse back and forth between the shapes of the lines. We can also use a static one, which will just simply fill it with a scribble and won't animate at all. Or we can use the jumpy one. It's just a little bit more frantic than the one we had before. It's not so ease in, ease out. You can see it's just very static, almost like it's using linear keyframes. Now when you choose one of these, I'm going to go back to smooth. You also have the wiggles per second control, which will obviously speed up or slow down that whole wiggle effect. And 10 is a pretty good value. I'm just going to try out and push that up to about 20. And again, do a quick preview there, just a second or so. And once again, click. And you'll see now it's just got a bit more bounce to it. So there's obviously a lot of things here that you can use to define the lines themselves and the paths that they fill. But the most important setting, I think, is how you actually animate these, whether they scribble on or whether they scribble off. And that's done over here by animating the start and end points. So let's just click to cancel our preview. And let's make sure that we're exactly at 2 seconds along the timeline, because this is where this layer first appears. And what we'll do here is let's take the end point and drag that backwards all the way to 0. And you'll see that the scribble is actually receding all the way back to the beginning. So let's apply a keyframe there at 2 seconds and 0 value. And then I'll just scrub along maybe 10 frames or 15 frames maybe. Let's go 215. And then just take the end value there and drag it once again to 100%. Another quick preview of that will obviously show what we've done. We've animated the shapes so they appear one after the other, which is perfect. The reason why they appear one after the other, though, is actually over here, again in the effect controls, there is a button that's selected called Fill Path Sequentially. Now again, this has to do with the stacking order that I showed you at the very beginning of the masks themselves inside the timeline. The big heart was at the top, then it was the left, and then it was the right. And that is the order that they are filled with sequentially when we animate these 2 points here. If we turn that option off and do another preview, they will actually animate all at the same time. So you do have control over that. This is much more of almost a neon light effect, whereas fill path sequentially is a little bit more animated and good for character work. On that subject as well, don't forget that if these masks are animated, the scribble fill will adjust and match the shape of the mask itself. So this is a great way for doing cartoon animation with a scribble effect either in the middle or around the edge, because as soon as you animate those masks, the scribble moves with it. So you might want to try that out as well. Now, in order to finish off this animation, as well as having the scribble appear by moving across the shapes, we're also going to make them go out of the composition into the next sequence as well. So let's move our timeline along about a second to about 3:15 or so. Something like that. We can see it here in the bottom of the comp window. Make sure you're round about there. And then we'll come in and apply a keyframe for the start value. Okay, it's kind of working backwards here. We've already applied the end value so it appears. That was in order to get it to go from the top left to the bottom right. If we now animate the start point to go out, it will go from the top left to the bottom right and actually remove the same shapes that we've just drawn. So let's scrub along to the end of this layer in my timeline. That's at exactly 4 seconds. Go ahead and take that start value and drag that all the way across to 100%. Now if we do one final round preview of that, we can see the shapes draw on, stay for about a second, and then draw off again. Very interesting little effect, and that's all done with Scribble. Okay, let's take a look at our final shape generation effect inside of After Effects 6. First thing we'll do is let's come up to the Effect Controls window here and close it down. And let's come down to the timeline and solo two completely different layers. I'm going to turn off the solo for Scribble Solid so everything comes back in. And then further down the list here, we're going to isolate this layer called Checker Solid. It's a blue solid we can see here. Let's turn that on. And also Cab's movie. This is a movie that plays actually behind that solid, and that's going to be very important in just a second. Now what we'll do is select Checker Solid. This is the one we're going to be working on because we're going to apply a new effect called Checkerboard. So let's come up to the effects palette. Again, just type in the name that we want. And if we type in check, it should come up here with Checkerboard, which is another render filter, just like the circle one. Let's double click to apply that to our layer. And you'll see immediately that we have a checkerboard pattern, which repeats across the background. Very simple filter. And in all essences, this is pretty much everything it does. It creates a square pattern. Now, there's obviously different settings in here that we can adjust. First thing I want to point out is if we turn on the transparent background here in our composition, I can actually see gray pixels through here, okay? This is transparency we're seeing. It's not very easy to see at this point, so what we'll do is come across here to the size options, and let's take the width, which is currently 16, and let's drag that all the way up, and you'll see as I do, I'm revealing the transparent pixels behind. So this layer can actually be used for masking, okay? You could have a series of shapes on top here, which could be used as maybe a luma mat on one layer, and then underneath that you have another movie layer which shows through the transparent pixels. So it's a very interesting way to animate shapes on and off and use them for masking. Now, as well as having the width setting here, you can adjust the horizontal value as well. And that's all set here by what's called the width slider, which at the moment is set to the standard, which gives us square shapes. If we choose width and height sliders, it activates the height option right here, which we can also animate to give us separate values for the vertical shapes. Okay, so pretty flexible in that respect. What I'm going to do is to divide it evenly into the size of the composition we have. Now we have 720 by 540. I'm actually going to set the width here to 90 pixels. Okay, so we get an even number that goes across this way. And let's do the same for vertically because I know 90 divides quite easily into both of those values. So we've got an even number of shapes around the outside. And obviously the transparency area in here is going to show through whatever color is in the background. So if I go back and turn off the transparency again, we can see that the default background color for this composition is black. However, we're at 4 seconds at the moment. If you scrub your timeline back towards 3:15, you'll see the cab movie that we turned on does appear in here and actually fades out in transparency. I have 2 opacity keyframes applied to that, but you'll see here, obviously, we have our mask effect, which then fades through to black. That obviously means that ideally, I'd like the white squares to be filled with yellow, so it matches the old checker cab pattern that we have in mind here. Let's come back across to the effect controls. Let's just scroll down the list here, and we can see that color is set as an option of white. So go ahead and click on that and choose your default yellow color, say OK, and that will apply that over the top. Now you'll notice here also there is a feather property. This is what makes this filter quite unique. If we drop this down, we can individually feather either the width or the height, or obviously both together. But this just produces some interesting effects once you start feathering it. Almost makes 3D shapes out of it. Looks like sort of tubes that are stacked one on top of the other. Well, we can use this for quite an interesting transition, which is what I'm going to do right now. Let's just undo that and make sure that your timeline is set to 3:15. Okay, scrub back to 3:15. And let's go ahead and apply a keyframe here for the feather height. And let's crank that up a long way. Let's go up for 200 or so. Make it nice and strong. So this will be a good feather. It won't look like you'd expect it to appear into a checker pattern. But then let's move along to 4 seconds, which is roughly where the taxi disappears. And let's set the feather height all the way back down to 0. Okay, so we've got a nice smooth transition now from the feathered shapes with the taxis in the background down to our straight grid, which is going to look just fine. Now, another thing I want to do with this is also animate the actual size of the shapes as well, just towards the end of our animation. So what we'll do, let's just back up to 4 seconds. Okay, so it's right back at this point, and we're going to animate from here onwards the width and the height. So go ahead and apply a keyframe for both of those properties here in the effect controls. And then just move your timeline a little bit further across. Let's go for maybe 4:10 or 4:15, somewhere around about there. Again, just checking your composition window. And we'll change both of these so they're evenly divided into just 2 shapes either way. So 2 across the top and 2 across the bottom. That will obviously mean let's take the width here and make that 360, obviously half of 720. And let's change the height to 270, which is half of 540. So we end up with a nice large shape there, which is a good transition and a good zoom from feather to shape to enlargement. Now, if we preview that, I'm just going to hit the space bar there and do that. It's very, very sharp, okay? There's a lot of linear keyframe motion there, and we can obviously smooth this out on our timeline. So let's come down to the bottom right and hit the U key, and that will reveal the keyframes that have been used here. We can see just the small set there for width and height as these top 4 right here. I'm just going to drag and select across those, and let's hit F9 to ease in and ease out the motion. So now it will actually go very, very gently out from the square, speed up, and then slow down just before it reaches that final point. Just makes it a bit smoother. So what we can do now is turn everything back on and see our finished animation. Let's come up here, let's close the effect controls down. I'm going to take my work area here in the timeline and drag that all the way back to the start. So it's back at 0. And let's just close up these layers here and unsolo both of 5 and 6 so we see all the finished graphics. Let's go ahead and hit 0 for a final round preview, and we can see everything going from the circles to our scribble effect, and that will just scroll across the screen as if they've been rubbed out. Now we get our checkerboard pattern in the background, and there's our finished composition. All the new shape rendering filters available in After Effects 6.